Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a reading wrap-up for the first half of this month of October in 2018. Over this month, I've enjoyed the last couple of things that I've read a lot more than I enjoyed the first couple of, so I'm going to go in reverse order so this doesn't start out on a negative note. I am currently a few pages from finishing Ahmed Saadawi's Frankenstein and Baghdad. This was translated by Jonathan Wright, and reading the description on the back, you would be forgiven for thinking that this is a horror novel because it frames it in that way, but what this really is a satire of the state of things in Iraq in 2005. And within this story of a neighborhood and people suffering and houses falling apart and helicopters overhead and political and government corruption and chat about religion and society and all of that, there is a side story where the junk dealer pieces together bits and pieces of the bodies of people who were killed in bombings, and early on the spirit of a man who was basically vaporized by a bomb inhabits this body, and our what's-its-name, which is what it ends up being called, goes forth and starts on a mission of revenge, aiming to get vengeance for all of the people whose body parts he's composed of, but as it goes on, that becomes more complicated and you get a lot of reflections about both cycles of violence and kind of ridiculousness, with a lot of bits and pieces about businessmen whose businesses are suffering and what kind of desperation that leads to, about elderly people who are hanging on to what's left of their lives even though their families are overseas. There's a moment in the junk dealer's house where he has a poster of the Verse of the Throne on the wall, and it falls down and there's a statue of the Virgin Mary underneath and it's broken, and then when that comes down there's a candelabra with Hebrew writing, and it's like, here's this history and all of this religion and all of this other stuff. It's all just being torn down by the state of affairs. So this was extremely entertaining, but it's not really a horror novel in the traditional sense. It is horrific in the sense that you go, here is a country that was invaded and is being dismantled at this point in 2005, and so that's horrific on a very human level, but despite the supernatural elements, I don't think it's really horror in that sense, despite how it's described. But this is great, and I fully recommend this because it surprised me. There were a lot of points where I thought this story is going this way or this is going that way, and it generally didn't, except when there was clearly a point to it going that way. So that was very entertaining. So prior to that, I read a piece of franchise fiction, and that is the Mass Effect Andromeda tie-in Initiation. This was written by N.K. Jemisin, although Mac Walters, who is one of the Mass Effect creators, is credited as a co-writer, I think, to make sure that fact-checking was done, because there was a Mass Effect tie-in written for Mass Effect 3 that basically didn't fall into continuity in the way that I think they wanted it to. So this definitely feels more like Jemisin's writing than it feels like the video game's writing. In any case, this tells the backstory of Khorram from Mass Effect Andromeda. She is one of the space mage type characters, which means that this is set in the future, but she basically has magical powers. There's technobabble that it explains it within the universe, but basically that's what this is, and this is her backstory before we lead up to the game. I thought this was much more entertaining than I expected it to be. I had been on the fence about this one because in part I wasn't a huge fan of Andromeda, and Khorram was one of my least favorite characters in the game, but I have been reading almost all of the novels except for that one that was reportedly terrible in the Mass Effect franchise library, so I did want to pick this one up, and as I said, I like N.K. Jemisin's writing, so I was on board to see what she would do with these characters, and I was surprised by how entertaining this was. This is a fun action romp. With books like, it's sometimes a question of, would you enjoy this if you hadn't played the game? And I think you would possibly enjoy this if you haven't played Andromeda, but have played the earlier Mass Effect games, but I think if you weren't familiar with the universe itself, most of the aliens appear without any explanation because there's an expectation that you understand this is what a Hanar is and this is what a Krogan is. Although this is very human and Asari-centric, so I think even given that, I don't think it necessarily would put you off, because I do think this is a fun action romp even without the Mass Effect framework, and in a way I actually think the suspense would work better if you hadn't played Andromeda, because you know that certain characters, Khorram among them, have to survive this because they're in the game. Whereas if you weren't familiar with the game, I think there could be a little bit more suspense building, because you don't necessarily know what's happening with Wright or Senior or Khorram. So yeah, this surprised me in how entertaining it was. Is this great literature? No, obviously not, but it was great fun, so 2 thumbs up for that one. My dog walking audiobook from the beginning of the month was The ThreeBody Problem by Cixin Liu, translated by Ken Liu, and this was read by Luke Daniels. I wasn't 100% sold on Luke Daniels' narration at the beginning because he uses a very gruff voice, and then an extra gruff voice when he's reading one character who's a former police officer, which almost crossed into parody for me. But once I got used to it, I found it very compelling. So as a narrator, he grew on me. The story itself is basically an alien first contact story, but it is hard sci-fi. And unlike a lot of the hard sci-fi that I've read, the focus is not on the engineering piece, the focus is more on the mathematics and physics piece, which I was very taken with, and I was really entertained by that. This also had a really interesting real-life grounding in that it opens with the main character's father being beaten to death by guards during the Cultural Revolution, and that really changes the flavor of everything that comes afterwards when it gets into more physics and aliens, because you still have that grounding in actual history. Interestingly enough, I've read since then that apparently that is not how the original opens. That's something that was done from the translation. And unfortunately in the audiobook, the translator's notes aren't included. And as far as I know in the print book, there is a fairly lengthy section of translator's notes, and I was sorry to have missed that. So I think that's maybe a sales point on picking up the physical book at some point, because I was disappointed not to have that, because knowing just that one change was made, that changes a lot of other things, and certainly changed my perception of the main character. But yeah, I was extremely entertained by this, and if you're looking for some hard sci-fi, this was really entertaining. Next up, we get into a few books that I was underwhelmed by. I picked up Volume 2 of the Backstagers. This is a comic book series about a group of stagehands on the stage crew at an all-boys school whose storage room is a portal to another universe. This is almost like a lighter, fluffier version of the same author's The Woods. This is written by James Tynion IV and drawn by Rian. The art is adorable, and it continues to be adorable. I really like the style of it. I think it has a real charm to it, but I felt like the story in this one was much too rushed. It felt like something that should have carried over at least 1, if not 2 extra issues within when this was being published in monthlies. I wasn't particularly satisfied by it, but I think it does maintain the charm of the first one. And this, I think, is aimed more at a younger teenage audience, and I think for that audience it's still a lot of fun. But yeah, the pacing just did not work for me, so I'm not gonna, and I can't talk about it much plot-wise because that would spoil a bit of the first story. Immediately prior to that, I read another book that was aimed at teenagers, and that is Darius the Great is Not Okay by Adib Khorram. And this is the story of an American teenager in somewhere on the West Coast. They talk about it being Chapel Hill, so I went through a couple of chapters thinking they were in North Carolina, but they're not. They're somewhere on the West Coast. And the main part of this story is that this kid who is dealing with bullying at school and clinical depression goes off for several months to see his dying grandfather in Iran. He's never met the grandparents there in person, but they've Skyped all the time. And it looks at a bit of the complexities of his relationship with his parents and his relationship with his grandparents. I thought when this was good, it hit some really fun notes. It had that kind of obnoxious thing that a lot of teenagers who think a lot of themselves, but maybe other people don't, of having these kind of fancy phrases for things that he then repeats a lot. Which I read some other reviews of this and some people were annoyed by that. I was very entertained by that because I kind of obnoxiously did that when I was a teenager, so I liked seeing that. I thought a lot of the social aspects, especially when the family initially goes to Iran, were really well done in terms of having these relationships. The experience that I think a lot of people who are second or the 1.5 generation removed from whichever of their parents' countries have when you go back and are dealing with people who should be closer relatives in any other situation, but you have this separate block. As the book went on, I thought I've felt like there were a lot of bits and pieces that hadn't been carried through. The characters in this are Zoroastrian, which, when I thought about it, I don't see most of the, and I want to say Parsi, but I think when they're in Iran they don't actually call them Parsi. But most of those the characters that you see of that are in Indian settings, or overseas Indian settings. So it was interesting to see that set in Iran. But then it did some things that surprised me, because the mother is married outside of the community. Her husband, this character's father, is German American and not of their religion. And there's a bit of thing where the character touches on that, about how they can't be part of the religion because of the way it's passed on. But then at the end there's this family moment where they all go to the fire temple, and I lifted an eyebrow at that a bit, because from everything I've heard from friends who are Parsi, you can't bring outsiders into the fire temple. Now, maybe that's different in Iran, because as I said, most of the people I know who are of that religion, and most of the other portrayals I've seen, are via India, but I found that surprising because the character mentioned earlier on that that meant they weren't part of the culture. There's also kind of a build-up with the father where he's very distanced from him in a way that's almost odd, because they share this clinical depression diagnosis, and they react weirdly to relatives who are very dismissive of the fact that both of these characters take antidepressants, but they take them in front of the other characters and then complain that the other characters don't respect them. And it seemed odd to me that they weren't either claiming it because they're doing it in public and trying to change minds intentionally, but they're clearly not, because they're unhappy with that. But then you wonder, why don't they take their medication in private? So I thought some of that wasn't super well done. Also, I had thought at one point that they were building towards the father being second or maybe third generation, because the main character is always referring to his father as Teutonic, and at one point we find out paternal grandmother they call Oma, so I thought, okay, we're building towards him having had German immigrant either parents or grandparents, but that was never touched on, so I thought that was a little odd. A lot of the school stuff I thought was a little weak, but when it was good, it was very good, so yeah. Your mileage may vary, I guess. And finally, the first book that I read this month was Roxane Gay's Difficult Women, which is a series of short stories about women, not who are difficult, but who have difficulties in their lives. Mostly for a combination of bad luck and then poor choices. Sometimes more one or the other, but a lot of that. It's very sexual in nature and very, I don't want to say depressing, because most of the situations are not the worst situations people could be in, but they're in situations where I found myself mostly going, that's unfortunate, or that led to somewhere horrible, but it was clearly telegraphed that it was horrible, and not necessarily in a literary way, but if you saw someone doing that in real life, you'd think, that's not going anywhere good. I enjoyed the writing style of this, but I didn't particularly enjoy the content, and if this had been a novel, I probably would have not finished it, because I would have assumed it is all of that type and put it down. But because they were short stories, I kept imagining that there would be some different thematic or content elements, so I kept going with it because I did like the writing style. But as it turned out, there were not a lot. There were a couple of speculative fiction pieces in here that I thought were interesting, but there's one, especially one with a glass woman, that is very heavy-handed in a way that surprised me, so I thought that wasn't quite as good as the rest of it, both style-wise and content-wise, which is not to say that I didn't think the content was good, just that it was not for me. So I thought this was well done, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. So, which was interesting, because I enjoy her nonfiction writing, so that was an interesting experience. Anyway, that is most of the first half of October. I actually have a couple of other things ongoing that I think I'll talk about in the next one. Yeah, so that's it for now. Ciao.